Welcome back. It's Now with Dave Brown on AMI Audio and AMI TV. Last week, the federal government held an online virtual national summit on racism. The first day focused on anti-Semitism and the second day on Islamophobia. Advocacy groups, interested parties, alongside government officials, took part in the forum, submitting proposals and strategies to move forward. Fareed Khan, founder of Canadians United Against Hate, was an attendee on both days, and Fareed joins us now from Ottawa to give his impressions and the potential for change. Hey, Fareed, thank you so much for making time for us today. It's nice to speak with you once again.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So can you give us some of the specific issues that were discussed at the conference?
Yes. Well, obviously, both conferences came about as a result of rise in hate against both groups, particularly the one, Islamophobia, was a direct result of the murder of the Afzal family in London back in early June. The issues obviously had to do with what government could do to address hate in Canada, what actions it was going to take, and in both conferences there were certain calls to action from the government to undertake policies and strategies to address the rise of hate in various ways, including in particular the rise of hate in online forums, which has been a key avenue by which people are being radicalized.
You had a chance to present at this summit as well as attend, and in a paper that you'd submitted, you mentioned more than once a connection between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. What's that connection that you've identified?
Well, we have been seeing increased acts of hate, attacks, and certainly online for quite a number of years now. If people recall, back in 2017, we had the mass murder at the Quebec City Mosque. We've had incidents of hate targeting places of worship across the country, both mosques and synagogues. There have been incidents in public, and certainly there's been a lot of reports, media reports of attacks against Muslim women across the country. Jewish members of the Jewish community have also faced incidents of hate. There was just one recently in a park in Toronto where a man with a swastika on his chest, verbally accosted a woman with her child. So there is this undercurrent of hate that has been increasing across the country, and of course with the pandemic, with so many people having been locked down for a year, a lot of those people who are predisposed to hate or have prejudicial attitudes, they've basically been sitting at home and consuming hate online. So now that we are getting back into an environment where restrictions are being lifted, we're seeing a lot more acts of hate played out in public. And there was a report that came out recently which said that as we get back to normal, there's likely to be even more increases in acts of hate in public. So it's something that we have to be aware of. It's something we have to watch for. We have to stand against it, and we have to try and take action to prevent it from happening.
Yeah, those digital algorithms, as well as the digital space in general, certainly are a major concern. But as are what we'd sort of consider more mainstream sources of media, in your paper, you did offer a critique of a media portrayal of Muslims. Portrayal is something that we talk about a lot on the show, specifically around disability, but inclusion in general. What can the federal government and advocacy groups do to challenge negative media depictions and to hold media organizations accountable for those depictions?
Media and mainstream media plays a huge role in shaping the minds of the public around certain issues. Certainly the Muslim community has felt it since after 9/11, as governments in a way or put in place all kinds of national security and anti-terrorism policies, there was narratives that were used that were pejorative, that were negative, that were delegitimizing of the Muslim community, and that played itself out in media as well, because media platforms, mainstream media platforms, newspapers, TV, radio, repeated the language that governments were using, and it also gave platforms to people who had, let's say, racist views to put out their narratives. When those things happen, it's up to the public to ask ourselves, what kind of society do we want? Do we want a society that allows this sort of thing to be accepted, or do we want a society where we do have diversity and inclusion and acceptance? History has shown, and the prime example, of course, is Nazi Germany. History has shown what happens when media basically is portraying negative, prejudicial, and racist attitudes towards a particular community. The public sees it, it absorbs it, it starts repeating it, and then it becomes just part of the public narrative. And unfortunately, what we've seen, and in particular over the last 20 years with the Muslim community, Islamophobia has become part of the public narrative. There are even polls that were done a few years back which said that about a third of Canadians found that bigotry against Muslims was seen as acceptable within the public sphere. And if that's the case, then no wonder we've got a rise in attacks. We've had 11 people murdered over the last 4 years just for the fact that they were Muslim. That's what we get if we allow it to perpetuate.
The federal government has promised increased funding for certain anti-racism projects, plus improved efforts to tackle the social media issue and misinformation. What do you make of those steps?
Well, these are first steps. These are baby steps, frankly. We have been calling for a number of years now, we've been calling for the government to undertake a very aggressive and a very public anti-hate strategy across the country, coordinated with provincial governments, with a very strong public education component to tackle hate in all its forms across this country. I think over the last 2 years, Canadians have come to a realization, especially since the murder of George Floyd in the U.S., about the perniciousness of racism, bigotry, and hate in this country. We had huge public outpourings last year, demonstrations last year with in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. Of course, this year with the Afzal family murder, we had expressions across the country from Canadians about how this hate was unacceptable. And then with the discovery of the bodies of Indigenous children at former residential school sites, finally there's a public realization that we have to do something about what has been done to Indigenous people and the racism, the institutionalized racism they have faced, and the fact that they were victims of genocide. And the thing is, the government cannot ignore this. They cannot ignore this. And now we've got an election coming up. There will be promises made, but it's up to the public to not only demand of government, of the federal government, that action be taken and policies be put in place, but they also have to continue to keep the pressure up, because it's very easy for government to say things during an election and then basically ignore those promises after they get into power, and we can't have that.
Fareed, you mentioned these promises that have been made are baby steps, and even the summit that was held last week is certainly only a first step. What were your takeaways from that summit? After that experience of a couple of days, where did that leave your mindset in regard to the conversations that we're having more broadly?
Well, from the two communities, clearly there is a very real fear out there about how the communities are being impacted. In both cases, we had speakers provide, very, very compelling testimonials. There were demands made in both conferences of the government to take action. And, from some, there were comments about, why did it take this long? And secondly, is this only for show because we've got an election coming up? And that's the thing. That's one of there's a very deep cynicism out there that these two conferences were done because there is an election that is just around the corner, and the government wants to be seen to be doing something about it before they go into an election, so they can say, "Hey, look, we held these two conferences, and we said we were going to do this." But there's a cynicism that this was a PR effort. And I think, that's not unexpected, given that, political parties and governments in the past have gone into elections saying that they're going to take major decisions or, implement policies on major issues of the day. And then once they get into power, they either downplay it or they don't act upon it at all. Once again, I go back to saying that it's up to all Canadians, not just the affected communities, to ask ourselves, what do we want in this society? We've seen how things can go. We've got a neighbor to the south. We see how things happen there all the time. But we can't, sit smugly and say, well, we're nothing like that. Well, the fact is, we are like that. And I think Canadians are coming to the realization that we are like that. It's just that we haven't wanted to admit it in the past. But now I think a lot of Canadians are admitting to ourselves that we're in many ways no different than the U.S. And if we want to be the sort of country we think we are, that we portray ourselves as, then we've got to undertake serious and concrete and aggressive action against hate, bigotry, and racism in Canada in every facet, not just in terms of society, but at the institutional level, because racism is ingrained in our society, and we need to address it wherever we see it.
You've been listening to Now with Dave Brown. Hit the subscribe button on any podcast platform and leave us a rating and a review.